Hey guys, so this is an extra review PowerPoint that I've put together for you. If you know everything that's in this PowerPoint, backwards and forwards, and you've done those practice tests, there's no reason that you shouldn't get a high A on this exam, okay? So really pay attention to what's in here, pick apart these important differences I'm about to tell you, keep these notes in your mind, and then practice those practice exams because you know that test questions come from there. But other than that, you should be pretty well set for this exam. I spent a long time on this PowerPoint to get it ready for you guys. So by chapter, let's start out with chapter 9, Thinking and Language. So this all goes back to thinking, the idea of cognition. Definitely know the definition of cognition, all the mental activities associated with thinking, knowing, remembering, communicating. Great. It's all about mental processes, mental activities. Remember that algorithms are slow, but they're always accurate. So this would be like looking through every single aisle of the grocery store from start to finish to find something. That guarantees that you're going to find that thing that you're looking for. I guess unless it's sold out. But if all you're doing is trying to locate the item, this will absolutely get you to the location of the item. And then a heuristic is faster, but it's error prone. So sometimes it's not faster because if you make too many mistakes, now it's become a longer process than it needs to be. But heuristics are supposed to be faster. However, you might not get the solution. So an example of a heuristic is the rule I before E except after C. Well, sometimes you have violations of that rule, like in science, there's a C, so the E should come before the I, but it doesn't. It's not science, right? Same thing with glacier. So this is faster for most words, right? But not faster for all of them because you can make a mistake. Okay, know the difference between insight and intuition. So insight, sudden realization of a problem solution. It contrasts with what we call strategy-based solutions. So strategy-based solution is an algorithm or a heuristic. Insight does not use strategy, right? Insight is something that happens unconsciously. It's an unconscious process that then has a conscious result, right? So you're kind of processing it unconsciously, and then consciously the answer comes to you and you have that aha moment that I talked about. So know that we're not using strategy when we have insight. It's just sort of an unconscious process that gives us an aha moment. So we're not using strategy. There's no game plan with insight. It just happens sort of automatically, naturally. Fixation is when you're unable to see a problem from a fresh perspective. Intuition is an unconscious process, right? That's all about effortless, automatic feelings and thoughts. So anytime we're talking about intuition, you should be thinking this is unconscious. This is not something that I'm aware of. It's like a gut feeling. It's unconscious. Representativeness heuristic, I really highly doubt you're going to get asked a detailed question about that. In particular, I would expect a detailed question about availability heuristic more. Representativeness heuristic, I think as long as you know the definition, you're going to be pretty okay. Just know that we're estimating likelihood of events based on how it matches our prototypes. So this was that example. You can always go back to the chapter 9 PowerPoint video lecture. But this is that example of if I had, 80 cards that were janitors and 20 cards that were teachers, and we read off a description, what's the probability that it's a teacher, and no matter what that card says, the probability doesn't change, right? But we're using our prototype of what we think a teacher should be in order to evaluate the probability that it is or is not a teacher. And then availability heuristic, the likelihood of events based on their availability and memory. So how easily we can recall an example of something. Know that it often involves overestimating risk of danger, and it has to do with vivid and emotional events. Also, the availability heuristic often informs our intuition, right? So if we feel that certain events have a risk of danger, then our intuition, our gut feeling about something is going to reflect that. If we feel that plane crashes are much more common than car crashes, for example, which they're not, but if we thought they were, then anytime we were approached with the idea of flying on an airplane, our intuition, our gut feeling is going to kick in and make us fearful, because that availability heuristic, that overestimation of the risk of danger of something, is active and it's influencing our intuition. Availability heuristic influences intuition. Framing is just all about wording. If you see a question that gives an example of two different ways of saying the same thing, it's all about framing. That's your answer. 25% lean versus 75% fat. We're saying the same thing, just in different words. 10% risk of death versus 90% chance of survival. This is a common one with birth control. 99.9% effective in protecting against pregnancy. 0.1% chance of pregnancy, right? Or the other way around, 999 times out of 1,000 you won't get pregnant, but 1 in 1,000 times you might, right? Creativity, the ability to produce new, that's important, new, innovative, and valuable ideas. And then we've got convergent and divergent thinking, which I kind of like to think about as inverse triangles, or inverted triangles. And so for convergent thinking, here's our problem. Let's say the problem is I've started a new business and I need to advertise for that business, but I don't know, I don't have unlimited money, so I can only advertise in some ways. Should I advertise on social media or on a billboard, or, right? So those are kind of all of our options. We could do a billboard, we could do social media, we could do TV, we could do radio, right? And then you narrow down all of those solutions to the one best solution. Let's say that my target audience is a high school and college level students. And so maybe we decide to use social media because that's going to reach them the best. So this is all about narrowing down. If you see the words narrowing down, we're likely talking about convergent thinking, into one best solution or one correct answer. It doesn't necessarily always have to be a correct answer, but it can be a best solution. And then divergent thinking is going to be the other way around. So with divergent thinking, let's say that the problem is that too many students are failing the course. And so we think, what are all of the possible ways? How many possible ways can we think of to help students succeed in this class, right? We can implement an SI program. We can have academic support programs. We can have free tutoring, right? I'm trying to think of just as many solutions as we can possibly find. Expanding on our solutions is our keyword there. Language is all about spoken, written, or signed words and the way that we combine them in order to communicate meaning. A phoneme is the smallest distinctive unit of sound. A morpheme is the smallest distinctive unit that carries meaning. So remember, morpheme, meaning. Morpheme, meaning. Whereas phoneme, well, when you're on the phone, what are you doing? You're listening to something. So a phoneme is a unit of sound. Sound. Morpheme, meaning. Okay. Grammar comes down to two parts, and those two parts are semantics and syntax. If you just associate semantics with the meaning of words and you just associate syntax with the order of words, that should be enough to answer any test question that you're going to get. So again, semantics is about meaning. So if we have a song, or if we have a sentence like, he hit the hardest note of the hit song and then he was hit by a flying tomato, it's the context or the semantic rules, the semantics, that communicate a different meaning for the same word. So he hit the hardest note, he reached it, of the hit song, of the popular song, and then he was hit, he was physically assaulted by a flying tomato, right? And then syntax is about the ordering of words. So in English, we always put adjectives before nouns, White House, but in Spanish, they would put the noun before the adjective, Casablanca. So again, semantics is meaning, syntax is order. Aphasia is an impairment of language, and it's usually caused by left hemisphere damage to Broca's area or Wernicke's area. There's some other language processing areas in the left hemisphere that could impair language if damaged, but for the most part, aphasia is caused by damage to Broca's or Wernicke's area. For Broca's area, that's going to be frontal lobe motor cortex, and it's your speech that is impaired. You do not have the capacity to move your facial muscles in such a way so as to speak. Wernicke's area is in the temporal lobe of the auditory cortex, and that's an issue with comprehension. So I can say words, but they're not going to come out right because I don't understand the meaning of the words that I'm saying or the meaning of the words that other people are saying to me. So it's comprehension, understanding that's impaired, which of course then in turn inhibits their communication of ideas too. But the act of speaking is not a problem. It's what they're speaking that's the issue, because comprehension and understanding is what's lacking. Okay, moving on to chapter 10, intelligence. So the intelligence is the ability to learn from experience, solve problems, and use knowledge to adapt to new situations. Spearman's general intelligence, there is one general level of intelligence that underlies all of our mental abilities. One general level of intelligence. So we are all characteristically some level of intelligent. Some people are more intelligent than others, but the idea is that it underlies all your mental abilities and it does not fluctuate, not very much at least. Gardner's theory couldn't be more opposite. He says we have 8 different types of intelligence, and among those would be linguistic, your intelligence with communicating words or ideas. Logical, mathematical, musical, spatial. Bodily kinesthetic refers to things like dancing or running, things like that involve coordination. Intrapersonal, your interactions. I never remember the difference between intrapersonal and interpersonal, but nonetheless, they both have to do with your interactions with other people or with yourself. And then naturalistic intelligence as well. Sternberg's triarchic theory, just know that analytical intelligence is book smarts, creative intelligence is innovative smarts, and practical intelligence is street smarts or common sense. And then emotional intelligence is regarding the ability to perceive, understand, manage, and use emotions appropriately. So perceive, to recognize emotions in other people. Understand, that would have to do with sympathy and empathy. Manage would be knowing when and to what extent to express your emotions. So if you're angry, knowing not to punch a wall in front of other people or something like that. And then using emotions, just being able to adequately express the way that you feel to others. Intelligence test is a method for assessing an individual's mental aptitudes. Remember that an intelligence test is supposed to be an aptitude test, and comparing them with those of others using numerical scores. And so we've got the achievement and the aptitude test. The achievement test assesses what you currently know. So we take an achievement test after we're supposed to have learned something. So it assesses what you know right now in this very moment, what you currently know. Whereas the aptitude test is trying to predict or assess your ability to learn something in the future. So if you've ever taken one of those, what do they call them? In high school, you take one of those exams that is supposed to place you in the career field that is most appropriate for your skill set. That's sort of like an aptitude test. They're trying to predict what you would do well at in the future based on characteristics that you have right now. A job inventory. I think that's what it's called. Yeah. Okay, and then this is kind of just a small note in this chapter, but it is a big deal. So, just start next to that. So the eugenics movement is a movement that proposed measuring human traits and using the results to encourage only smart and fit people to reproduce. This had to do with selective breeding. And so people who are part of the eugenics movement are looking for genetic markers in people or genetic capabilities. And they encourage very highly intelligent people to mate and therefore to have more highly intelligent children. And the idea is that, of course, this is hugely dangerous, but the idea is that through this selective breeding, you could theoretically create like the perfect race or something like that, the perfect set of characteristics in a person by breeding together people who are highly intelligent in different ways. So that's what eugenics is all about. It's all about just sort of selective breeding of human beings in order to create an offspring that has certain characteristics and a new generation of offspring that has those characteristics. And then this is the normal curve for intelligence test scores. Know it, love it, memorize it. This is important, I promise. So a couple things that you want to know is that number one standard deviation in intelligence test scores is 15 points. It's one standard deviation. So 2 standard deviations are going to be 30 points above the average, right? So on and so forth. Every standard deviation is 15 points away. 68% of people fall within 1 standard deviation of the average score. It's your average. So most people fall within 1 standard deviation, fall between 85 and 115 on an intelligence test score. But if you're scoring something like 130, well, that's really, really high. Because if you think about it, only 2% of people are going to be scoring higher than that, while 98% of people are scoring lower than that. If you manage to get something as high as 145, this space between 145 and the end of the curve only holds 0.01%. So this is super rare to score that high or to score that low if you're thinking about it on the other side. But just kind of know what these markers are, that 1 standard deviation is 15 points higher, so 2 standard deviations is 30 points higher, 3 standard deviations 145 points higher. And know sort of these percentages too, that 68% of people fall here, 95% of people fall between 1 and 2 standard deviations, which leaves a little over 2% on both sides, right? Sorry I made that like so messy, but okay. Standardization, kind of the key words that you want here are pre-tested group, and then this idea of meaningful scores is important too. So standardization is all about bringing in a sample of people to take some tests that you've devised and then plotting them onto a chart, and you just keep bringing in more and more and more people to take your test until your sample of participants looks almost identical to the normal curve. So once you get all of your data close to looking like a normal curve, that's when your test is standardized and it's ready for actual comparison to other people. So then you bring in someone to take your test and you have someone to meaningfully compare them to. Because look, if you just made some test, just any test that you wanted to, just made one and gave it to me, it doesn't matter what my score on that test is if we're not comparing me to other people, right? Because if I score a 60 on your test, does that mean that I don't know much? Or is perhaps the average that most people are going to score on your test a 30 or a 40? So maybe I've done really well. Well, in order to make those scores meaningful, we've got to compare them to a pre-tested group. And that's the idea behind standardization. That's why we need it. And so here are some examples of questions that you could be asked on your exam that refer to standardization. I just find that these questions tend to be hard ones for people, so I wanted to give you some examples. When Brandon was told that he correctly answered 80% of the items on a math achievement test, he asked how his performance compared with that of the average test taker. Brandon's concern was directly related to the issue of standardization. Would be your multiple choice answer. Before publishing That's kind of an important note because now it's clear that we're pre-testing, right? Before publishing her test of musical aptitude, Professor Reed first administered the test to a representative sample of people. There's your pre-tested group. This was most clearly necessary for test standardization. Same thing. Here's another example of a question you could be asked. If a test is standardized, this means that it accurately measures what it's intended to measure. No, that refers to validity. A person's test performance can be compared with that of a representative pre-tested group. Here we go. Most test scores will cluster near the average. Well, that's just true. And the test will yield consistent results when administered on different occasions. That is reliability. So again, reliability is consistency, the extent to which a test produces consistent results. And another key word is retesting. If you see the word retesting in a test question, it is so likely that we're asking about reliability. When retested, a student tends to get approximately the same score on their exam each time. This most clearly illustrates reliability. So look for that word retesting. Or look for the word consistent or consistency. Validity, the extent to which a test measures or predicts what it's supposed to. So the accuracy of the test. Does it measure what you're trying to measure? That would be content validity. The content of your exam is valid. It actually measures what I'm trying to measure. Does it predict what you're trying to do? That would be predictive validity. Is it accurate in predicting what I'm trying to predict? So basically what you're asking is it a good test? Does it do the thing that you want it to do? That's what validity is concerned with. Whereas reliability is concerned with, if we give this test multiple times, are we getting approximately the same results? If we retest, are our results consistent? Cross-sectional versus longitudinal. So both of these are involved in looking at differences over time with age. But with cross-sectional studies, we take people of all different ages collected at the same point in time and we compare them to one another. Whereas a longitudinal study begins with a group of people when they're young and then follows and retests them over time. Cross-sectional study is just one test and it's a sample of people of all different ages, so we can immediately compare them. Whereas the longitudinal study follows and retests the person over time and then compares them with their old self, with their old scores. Crystallized intelligence is just facts or knowledge that accumulate with age, which is why crystallized intelligence increases with age, because you just gather more and more facts and knowledge as you grow. And then fluid intelligence is the ability to reason speedily and abstractly, i.e. to think on your feet, to problem solve quickly. And as you might notice, that decreases with age. You're a whole lot more apt to solve things like Sudoku puzzles or whatever while you're younger. But when you get older, that quick problem solving ability kind of fades. And then some group differences in intelligence test scores. Women outperform men in spelling, verbal fluency, locating objects, detecting emotions, sensitivity to touch, taste, and color. So basically, linguistic and emotional activities. And then it's also kind of common knowledge that women have stronger senses than men. That's why there are way more men that are colorblind than women who are colorblind. But if we're talking about something linguistic or emotional, that's going to be something a woman will excel at more than a man. Whereas men tend to outperform women in spatial ability and complex math problems. So if you see examples relating to like engineering or problem solving or math, those are kinds of things that men are going to outperform women in, at least by a little bit. And then racial differences exist in intelligence test scores, but mostly because intelligence tests are biased and require people to have certain cultural experiences and exposure in order to answer questions correctly. And so that leads to this idea that a lot of people are purporting that we make culture fair tests, tests that don't depend on you having some previous experience or knowledge in order to solve the problems. And then that also leads to stereotype threat if we're talking about racial differences. So stereotype threat refers to an anxiety that you'll be negatively evaluated based on a stereotype. So the fear that you'll be stereotyped. And know that this anxiety is going to inhibit your performance. It's going to make it difficult for you to perform well because you're under pressure, right? Performance suffers under pressure. And that's what stereotype threat has to do with, except it's pressure that results from the fear that you're going to be stereotyped. And that inhibits your performance. So it's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. I'm so worried that I'm going to be stereotyped that I actually make myself perform worse so that maybe I am stereotyped as a result. Okay. This is very short, at least, since we cut out most of chapter 11. Asexual is having no sexual attraction to others. Remember, if we put a in front of a word, that just negates it. So, asexual, the absence of sexuality or the absence of a sexual attraction to others. Testosterone is present in greater quantities in males than in females, but females still have it, and it's responsible for increasing sexual drive in both females and males. So people sometimes think, well, if testosterone is responsible for sexual drive in males, then estrogen is responsible for sexual drive in females. That is not the case. Testosterone dictates sexual drive in both males and females, but males just characteristically have higher levels of it than females do. And then estrogen is present in greater quantities in females than in males, but males still do have it. And estrogen is responsible for ovulation in females, which is why if you've ever seen ingredients on birth control, estrogen is one of those ingredients because it prevents ovulation from happening if it's measured in the right quantity in your body. Sexual response cycle, know the order. Excitement, plateau, orgasm, resolution. Remember, the graph looks something like this, where we're increasing in arousal, excitement, and then plateau, it gets flat. Then we have a big boost of it, peak up here at orgasm, and then arousal goes back down during resolution, back down to base level. A sexual dysfunction is a problem that impairs proper sexual functioning. So this would be like erectile disorder for men or female orgasmic disorder for women. It's just an inability to get through one of these phases in the sexual response cycle. So if it's erectile dysfunction for men, then that's an issue in the excitement phase. If it's female orgasmic disorder, that's an issue in the orgasm phase for females, right? But this is something that isn't like frowned upon or looked at as inappropriate. It's just sort of a bodily malfunction that we have to take care of medically. Whereas a paraphilia, now this is something that's unusual, atypical, strange, inappropriate, disgusting, some kind of sexual urge or desire that fits those characteristics, such as a sexual attraction towards children, right? It usually involves harm to other people or non-consenting persons or inanimate objects, things like that. And then erotic plasticity. We haven't really talked about this term, but it's important as it relates to sort of sexual fluidity. But erotic plasticity is the extent to which your sexual drive varies. And so, women have much greater erotic plasticity than men. And that really means that women at some points are very, very motivated sexually, and at other points have very little interest in sexual behavior at all. Whereas men, for the most part, are pretty willing to engage in sexual activity most of the time. It's not hard to get a man sexually aroused. But when it comes to women, there's a whole lot more variables, and mostly because it involves a lot of sort of cognition, mental activities for women, whereas for men, it's more physical. But in any case, it also has to do a little bit with sexual orientation, in that women have more erotic plasticity or sexual fluidity or flexibility as it pertains to what they are attracted to. So oftentimes, straight women can still become aroused by other women, but straight men are not going to become aroused by other men. So it's like that as well. It just refers to variability, which means like changeability, how much your sexual motivation or your sexual attraction changes or varies over time or over different circumstances. Remember the plasticity, that's a good word to kind of know that. Plasticity just means like flexibility or changeability. And then erotic, dealing with sexual motivation. sexual orientation, and enduring. That's really probably the most important word in this whole definition. An enduring sexual attraction to members of one's own sex, the opposite sex, or both sexes. So homosexual, heterosexual, bisexual. And so, like I said, that word enduring is so important because sexual orientation is not willfully chosen, nor is it willfully changed. And by willfully, I just mean you can't motivate yourself to change your sexual orientation. No matter how hard you try, it's not something that you are able to willfully, to will to change, right? Not only can we not choose it, but we also can't change it. We know some genetic factors that contribute to sexuality, like the fraternal birth order effect. So that's the fact that the more biological older brothers a man has, the higher the likelihood for him to have a homosexual orientation is. And with each subsequent male pregnancy, the chances of having a homosexual son increase. But again, this is only about male pregnancies and sons. We do not see this with females. It's not like girls who have a lot of older sisters are more likely to be gay. That's not what we see. It all has to do with male pregnancies, and that's just because of antibody levels in a female's body when she has a male fetus that she's pregnant with. And then identical twins are quite likely to share the same sexual orientation compared to fraternal twins or regular brother and sister. Prenatal hormones play a role too. But what we do not know is what environmental factors contribute to sexual orientation. There is not one environmental factor that we have found to be constant or consistent between all or even many people who are homosexual. So we do not know what the environmental factors are that contribute to sexual orientation. We work off the assumption that there are probably some environmental factors because nothing really is just nature and no nurture or vice versa. Everything is a combination of both. But nonetheless, we don't know what those environmental factors are. We only know the genetic ones. And then lastly, chapter 12, almost done. So know the 3 components of emotion. Anytime things come in threes, that's a great thing to memorize because how many multiple choice questions do you have or answers? 4, right? So it's likely it would be like, which of the following is not a component of emotion, right? So know that it involves physiological arousal, expressive behaviors, and conscious experience. You can think of it as ABC, right? Arousal, behavior, consciousness. So James Lange theory says, first, we've got our physiological arousal, and then we experience emotion. So our emotion results from our physiological arousal, right? And then Cannon-Bard says physiological arousal and emotion happen at the same time. And two-factor theory says, well, it's not just that physiological arousal is going to lead to emotion, but also your cognitive label of that arousal leads to emotion. So not just one thing leading to emotion, but 2 factors. The two-factor theory, 2 factors lead to or result in emotion. And so still talking about that 2-factor theory, this explains why we can experience more than one different emotion when we have the same physiological response. So like I said, that physiological arousal paired with your cognitive label are going to together produce your emotion. And so if all we have is the physiological arousal, a pounding heart, that could mean anxiety, that could mean surprise, that could mean excitement, that could mean fear, but we don't know, right? We don't know until we cognitively label it. Once we put a label on it, now we understand the emotion that we're experiencing. That's what the 2-factor theory is dealing with. And then there's also something called the spillover effect, and that, I'm gonna erase this right here, and that is when you have been physiologically aroused, so your body is experiencing something like a pounding heart, for example, and you move on to do something else, and that lingering physiological arousal, that pounding heart that is sort of tapering off now, is still going to spill over and affect your emotion. So there was a famous study on the spillover effect where men were asked to walk across this dangerous, unstable bridge. And so that got their hearts racing and elevated their sympathetic nervous system arousal. Remember, your sympathetic nervous system is going to be the thing that arouses you in a fight or flight situation. So when something makes you nervous or anxious, it's your sympathetic nervous system. And so immediately after crossing that scary bridge, the men were encountered by a woman who was part of the study, and she just asked them, a few questions on a survey. And then afterward, the men were asked questions about the woman. And so there were men in a control group who did not cross the scary bridge at all. All they had to do was walk across a very stable bridge that should have induced no anxiety, and then talk to the woman. And so what's interesting is that the men who were aroused, so they had walked across the scary bridge, their heart was still pounding, right? Rated the woman as more attractive than the men who were calm and did not have a pounding heart. And that's because, again, it's not just physiological arousal that determines emotion, but it's our cognitive label too. And so the idea is that once the man got across the bridge, his heart is still pounding. And so his brain interpreted that as nervousness around an attractive woman because he was no longer in danger. Okay, like I said, sympathetic nervous system arouses the body for a fight or flight response and floods the body with stress hormones. Your most popular stress hormone, cortisol. And then your parasympathetic nervous system calms the body after a threat has passed and removes those stress hormones from the bloodstream, calms you back down. As far as detecting emotion in others, we can easily distinguish between typical facial expressions of emotion. So joy, happiness, sadness, anger, disgust, surprise, and fear. We are so good at detecting emotion from facial expressions. But what we are really bad at detecting from facial expressions is lying. We cannot tell when people are lying, and neither can a polygraph. Polygraphs are just measuring your physiological arousal, but again, you can be physiologically aroused for a number of reasons. Maybe not because you're lying, but because it's anxiety producing to be strapped in a chair that's monitoring, all sorts of things about your body, right? So we can't tell when people are lying, certainly not by their facial expressions, and even a polygraph can't tell by physiological arousal. Know that the left side of the brain experiences mostly positive emotions and then also anger. So I know that's so weird because anger is like the most negative emotion I can ever think of, but nonetheless, the left side of the brain is for positive emotions and also anger, and the right side of the brain is for negative emotions like fear and disgust. And so what we found is it's less actually a divide between positive and negative emotions, and it's more a divide between what we call approach and avoidance tendencies. And so the left side is for approach motivation, and the right side is for avoidance motivation. So approach motivation is something that directs you to act, to actually go approach the problem and deal with it. And so, or it doesn't necessarily have to be a problem, but it directs you to approach a situation and deal with it. So if you're happy, if you're motivated by happiness, that's going to cause you to want to do something to get that happiness. And then anger is actually motivating in the opposite way, but it causes you to approach the problem. Anger is a very approach emotion. Anger is confrontational. Anger is something that you want to release at another person, right? Versus avoidance, like fear. Fear is going to not make you go attack someone, but run away, probably. And disgust, I can't imagine you wanting to get closer and approach something that disgusts you. You're likely going to run away, avoid it. So that's really the true difference between the left and the right side of the brain. But basically, you really just kind of need to know the left side is for positive emotions and the right side is for negative emotions, with the exception of anger. The facial feedback effect states that movements of your face, your facial muscles, can stimulate our emotions, such as smiling, making you feel happier. Frowning will also make you feel sadder, angrier. Scowling, I guess, makes you feel angrier. And then the behavior feedback effect is movements of the body that can stimulate our emotions, like standing up tall makes you feel more confident. Slouching makes you feel less confident, right? More insecure. So as it pertains to anger, we have this idea of catharsis, and catharsis is just a way to manage anger by releasing your aggression onto some appropriate target, like a punching bag. Note, though, that the idea of catharsis, the catharsis theory, goes against the behavior feedback effect, because the behavior feedback effect would say, if I'm acting angry, it's going to make me feel angrier, right? But catharsis is saying, no, you got to get that anger out and to release it, and then it goes away. We haven't had a lot of success with catharsis, but nonetheless, that's just what the idea is. But the behavior feedback effect tends to ring more true. And then for happiness, we've got the feel good, do good phenomenon. So this is when you feel happy, feel good, you're more likely to do nice things and helpful things, or to do good for others, which in turn makes you feel even better and more happy. So that's more behavior feedback effect, right? The more good things I do, the better I feel, and therefore I do more good things, and therefore I feel even better, right? Positive psychology is all about human flourishing, and then sort of the strengths and virtues of the human that help individuals and communities thrive. Thriving is really kind of the main goal. To live your best life. That's really what positive psychology is about, living your best life, thriving. Subjective well-being is a measure of your self-perceived happiness. Subjective, your opinion of your well-being, your health, your happiness. And then know the general adaptation syndrome is sort of a model that describes how we deal with and respond to and cope with stress. So the 3 stages of that are alarm, resistance, and exhaustion. So in alarm, you've just been confronted with some stressful situation or a deadline or something like that. In the resistance stage, you're working to overcome that obstacle. And then once you've finally done it, you are exhausted. You are depleted of your resources. And during the resistance phase is when you see stress hormones flood into the body. They initially start releasing during alarm, but mostly they're fully released into the body during the resistance stage. And then during exhaustion is when your parasympathetic nervous system is going to kick in and calm your body down and take those stress hormones out of your system. And then really all that's left is knowing the difference between type A and type B people. So people who are type A are competitive, impatient, irritable, high-strung, driven, stress-prone, and hostile. And hostile is the trait that is most correlated with the development of coronary heart disease. We see time and time again that type A personality people are way more likely to develop coronary heart disease than type B people, and it all kind of comes down to that underlying trait of hostility. So type A people who are more hostile have even a greater chance of developing coronary heart disease. But people who are generally type A, but they don't really experience hostility so much, are way less likely to develop coronary heart disease. And then the other side of that, type B, is going to be reflective, patient, emotionally stable, low maintenance, relaxed, stress avoidant, and empathetic. And they very rarely develop coronary heart disease. All right, that is that. So do the Quizlet. Number 1, do the Quizlet. There will be a lot of definition questions on this test. Do the Quizlet. Number 2, do the practice exams and the practice quizzes. You know the questions come from there. And number 3, really know what's in this PowerPoint. I have hand-tailored this to be helpful for you. So those are my suggestions, and good luck.